All right. We have a gentleman called Leon Lidigo in studios giving me a Kenya on the sticky issues as we kick off the Africa Climate Summit. But I had mentioned, Dr. Filippo Sano, this thing of loss and damage. What is it all about?
So I mean, let me start it differently before we go to loss and damage. So we have what we call climate extremes. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen high temperatures. We saw early in the what the show is one of the professors talking about sea level rise mm-hmm. and so on. So we have impacts of climate change that we can adapt to, but there will be impact to climate change that we cannot adapt to. So part of that is, as Mohammed talked about, because of historical emissions that is leading to this kind of devastating floods and so on. So countries that are affected would then need to get funds to help them rebuild, because when you have, say, massive flooding, mm-hmm. you have destruction of infrastructure and so on, you need to rebuild. And that's where the loss and damage comes in. So it's actually a separate fund from the 100 billion fund that Mohammed talked about that was committed to by developed countries to support developing countries to adapt to the impact of climate change. But I wanted to come, before loss and damage, I wanted us to remind ourselves of the fundamentals, because mm-hmm. I think we need to change course, because the fundamentals, climate change, to understand climate change, you need to understand the science. Mm-hmm. It's all about changes in weather patterns, all about mm-hmm. changes in rainfall, changes in temperature. Unfortunately, I think across Africa, a lot of countries in Africa are suffering from fiscal constraints around financing. In fact, 31 out of 37 heavily indebted poor countries in the world are in Africa. So they have very little capital to invest in infrastructure. That means we are not investing in our climate monitoring infrastructure. If you go to meteorological stations across Africa, Africa has the least coverage of meteorological stations. Yet we need to be measuring temperature, we need to be measuring rainfall, and that's why I think we just finished Climate Science Symposium for Africa. And one of the things that came out from there is that we need to have our African government invest massively in monitoring infrastructure, because we do need early warning systems. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a release of the climate outlook for the Horn of Africa, and we are projecting El Nino. You mm-hmm. can't do that if you don't have the fundamentals. You don't have, experts trained to do that. Our universities are not grossly underfunded. You go to our science departments, they're grossly underfunded. Our labs are not equipped. And I think that's a fundamental that we need to say, can we fund climate research in our universities, in our research institutions? Because at the end of the day, climate policy is informed by reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the latest report, which is the sixth assessment report, we actually had only 11% of the authors coming from Africa. So that's very, very little. So we need to also support our African scientists, support our Met departments in the region, so that they can actually set up this monitoring infrastructure for us to know the state of climate in the region. So that when you come to loss and damage, when you start to go to claim funds for mm-hmm. loss and damage, you have to show what's called attribution. Can you attribute that extreme climate event? Can you attribute it, actually? And you can't do attribution without the science. So I just wanted to emphasize that scientists are very important, and we should not wait like during COVID, where we call them when it's a crisis that we can't solve, and then we have them all around presidents trying to advise at the last minute. We need to invest in them before, so that they're well prepared to provide good advice based on the understanding of their local climate systems.
All right. Yeah. Fadel, are we missing the point, or is it a situation where we can walk and chew gum at the same time? Should we be primarily focused on reduction of emissions, pushing the global north in that direction? And also, I was looking at a review of COP27, and on the UN, it was a UN page, so I can't recall exactly where you can find it, but some address, but a UN page, and they were reviewing the COP27. And they were saying there was not enough commitment as far as reduction, because they're saying radical change is needed to go back to meet the 1.5 degree centigrade, something about pre-industrial levels. And also they said where coal is concerned, there was not enough commitment. So is that where our focus should be, or is it a situation where we can walk and chew gum at the same time?
Well, we do have to do multiple things at the same time to transform the system. But on the question of emissions, to be very clear, as Mohammed said earlier, Africa is responsible only for 4% of global emissions. That's the equivalent of Spain alone. So when we look at the science in terms of what is causing climate change, what is putting us into this crisis mode, it's fossil fuels. So the United Nations Environmental Program a couple of years ago produced a very important report called the production gap. And it's a very simple picture. It's the gap between how much we're planning to extract and burn by 2030, 2040, versus how much we're allowed to extract and burn in order to meet the climate challenge at 1.5 degree. So that gap needs to be closed. And the only way to close this on time, to save humanity and to move forward, is by doing two things. Number one, we must end the addition of new fossil fuel infrastructure, oil, gas, and coal. So that's number one. The problem is we are currently adding additional new fossil fuel infrastructure at the tune of 500 billion up to $1 trillion per year of new infrastructure that's meant to be there for decades into the future. So that is dangerous. Number two, what we're supposed to do is to design a plan for rapid phase out of existing infrastructure. So the science is very clear. We're not going to move forward without this. And what a lot of organizations around the world have rallied around is calling on our leaders, sovereign states, to sit down and negotiate an international treaty for phasing out fossil fuels. It's called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And dozens of cities around the world have endorsed it, calling on their sovereign states to sit down and negotiate. And this is an opportunity for Africa to lead the world in this space. So the science is very clear, the action is very clear, and the opportunity is amazing for our continent because we do have the resources to leapfrog into that clean energy era and use that opportunity not just to import electricity or energy from the rest of the world, but to industrialize in a clean and sustainable way and leapfrog into a world of sustainable prosperity.
All right, Wangari, you have something to add to that?
Yes, I think one of the other things, and just to, adding on what Tuhi just said, we need to also scale renewable energy. So we have all the technologies that are needed to deliver modern, clean electricity that is affordable to all Africans. I think he said it before, over 600 million people on the continent still do not have access to electricity. Yet we have abundant sun, wind, we have all the critical
I had
minerals.
the president say something about 60%
Yes.
of renewable energy.
Yeah, world's best solar resource. 60% of the world's best solar resources in Africa.
Okay.
We have enough wind power to power the continent 250 times over. We have all the critical minerals that go into batteries. We have all the different technologies in terms of EVs, as you saw the president driving yesterday. So we do have the technologies to transition. We need the money to come in. We need leaders to put their money where their mouth is and ensure that we invest also in this resource. I think there's one big misconception is that we have time. We don't have time. We need to start deconstructing our fossil fuel-based systems now. And those of us who don't have those heavy fossil fuel systems right now, like Kenya, we're at 92%. We shouldn't go backwards. We should go forward and start leading and exporting this green energy that we have on our grid to our neighbors and to the rest of the world.
All right. Mohammed, you had something to add before my next question?
Yeah. I'll add a small thing. When you're in a hole, the first thing you start doing is stop digging. We're now in a climate crisis, and the developed countries that got us into this problem in the first place are actually expanding their fossil fuel production. 80% of the planned expansion in fossil fuels is going to happen in North America, not in Africa. And so we need to actually differentiate this. The opportunity that exists largely exists in the industrialized countries. What we have in Africa is the potential, but I should say that potential won't be realized without finance flowing to Africa and without clean technology. So take the example of solar. This continent has 60% of the world solar endowment. we have 40% of the strategic minerals. But to actually tap that solar potential, you need solar panels. Do you produce them in Africa or you import? You have 40% of the strategic minerals. Do you add value to those minerals here, or do you export them in their raw form and then import the finished product? And when you import these things, do you import them in Kenya shillings or in dollar? What is happening to our economy in Kenya today with the depreciation of the Kenya shilling? Because we're largely an economy that is actually increasingly dependent on imports. So unless we strategically look at the intersecting crises of climate, energy, development, finance, debt, peace, we'll be missing the point. If our leaders approach this summit and narrowly look at it from a climate perspective, without looking at the structural crises that underlies it, we'll put a Band-Aid type intervention that won't go far enough. And then the second point I wanted to add, all this talk is about avoiding emissions in Africa. We just have 4%, and we're 17% of the global population. We were focused on how we can develop in a climate-compatible way, which is a good thing. But how about Africa adapting to the changing climate? How about Africa investing in what Philip said, which is a meteorological capacity, so that we can strengthen our early warning capacity? I come from the northeast of Kenya, a part of this country that has been ravaged by extreme droughts over the last years. And the incidence and severity of these droughts are increasing. But my folks back there don't know that you can actually predict the occurrence of a drought with precision today and be able to invest in your adaptive capacity so that you're not dependent on international appeals that at best provide you food handouts. Okay. So how do we protect the dignity of our population? Tell them, the climate is changing and the science is clear and we have all the information we require, and we need to actually invest in early warning, in risk reduction, so that we can provide them the adaptive capacity to be able to withstand any climate change that occurs. So that part around Africa adapting to live needs to be prioritized in an African summit.
All right. And Dr. Sano, if you'll allow me, I just want to get a rejoinder to that, or some, context. I picked something also, me and the website I was visiting yesterday, but I picked something also from the Africa Climate Summit website. And this was it. Let me just read it out verbatim. That hanging over COP27 was the specter that despite decades of meetings and landmark accords like the Paris Agreement, the world is still not doing enough to slow the climate crisis. So hanging over COP27 was the specter that despite decades of meetings and landmark accords like the Paris Agreement, the world is still not doing enough to slow the climate crisis. And I listened to the president's speech when he was opening the UN Habitat meeting the other day, and he talked about if we come to an agreement on this, we won't even need COP 29 and ban fuel trying to congregate there. But Fadel, does Africa have the muscle to pressure the global north, so to speak, to slow down on fossil fuel and all of that? Do we actually have it?
Well, this is a question of political will. I think we all understand what it takes to get there, but it's our leaders who have to unite behind a coherent, bold, and transformative action. We talked earlier offline about, what does it take actually to come to an agreement, to have 54 countries agree on a statement. Well, if the statement is weak and vague and general, it's very easy to agree very quickly. We sit down and say, this looks nice. But if we're talking about really transformative action that requires coordination, not at the meeting to sign a document, but after the meeting to say, we've committed to do this, now let's put our resources together. Let's unite behind this particular set of demands. I'll give you an example. When we talk about the question of climate finance, and we say, well, we have an external debt problem, climate finance is not something we can afford. So we have to ask ourselves as African nations, as leaders, what is causing this external debt constraint and this vicious cycle of external debt that we never seem to be able to overcome? So the debt is a symptom of much deeper structural issues that all of our countries struggle with. And those are three major structural deficiencies. Number one, it's food deficits. As I said earlier, we import 85% of our food. That's a huge financial constraint because you're simply borrowing money to feed your people every year. That's not sustainable. Number two, we have energy deficits, meaning we import all the fuel and the energy that we need to fuel our economy. And here I'm talking about even a country like Nigeria, a massive fossil fuel exporter. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline. So that is a structural problem that continues to drag our resources, financial resources. And number three, most importantly, we have a manufacturing deficit, meaning that we tend to specialize in exporting either raw materials or exporting low value added manufactured products. So we import the capital, the machinery, the inputs, and we rely on low cost labor to add very little value for exports, while we import high value added content, high tech products. So no matter how much we accelerate our manufacturing sector, if it's composed of low value versus high value in exports and imports, we're always digging ourselves deeper into the problem. So take these three structural deficiencies: food deficits, energy deficits, and low value manufacturing. You put them together, we have a trade deficit that is structural, that goes on for years and years and years. With a trade deficit, as you know, what happens is that the value of your currency, like the shilling, the Kenyan shilling, would fall relative to the dollar, relative to the euro, which makes anything we want to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine for our people, makes it more expensive. So we import inflation, and that becomes dangerous from a social, economic, political perspective. So what do our governments do? They step in immediately with a temporary band-aid solution, doing two things. One is we subsidize food and fuel to make it affordable for our people. And number two, we ask our central banks to borrow dollars and euros and British pounds and ask them to, could you please stabilize the exchange for us by borrowing dollars? That's how you do it. And that becomes the vicious cycle of borrowing. The good news is that once you understand these structural weaknesses, and that's what we want our leaders to rally around in this meeting, then the solutions are right there. In order to get out of the food deficit trap, we have to invest in food sovereignty and agroecology. And that's a climate solution and an economic solution. Once you understand the energy deficits that we struggle with, then the solution is right there. Invest in renewable energy sovereignty. And we have the opportunity with all the strategic resources that we have and the demand that we have. And that's, again, a climate solution and an economic solution. And finally, the industrial manufacturing mismatch that we have, that's also, the solution is right there. Leverage all the resources that we have to industrialize, to produce the renewable energy infrastructure that we need on the continent, not for exports, for our building blocks. And that's a climate solution and economic solution. So once we rally around those things, we need all of our leaders this week to unite behind a climate solution that's also an economic solution of transformation. And I'll close by saying this: there's no economy in the world that can function without food and without fuel. And those are our biggest structural weaknesses. And those are the first building blocks. We can't skip those and say we want to export other things or produce other things. First, the major building blocks, then add the complementary sectors that are needed for resilience and for adaptation. And that's the economic opportunity that we have. But we're not going to be able to come to an agreement unless we have serious technical conversations and cooperation, not in advance of these meetings, but also have a clear pathway after the meeting. Who's going to do what? How are we going to coordinate? And how do we unite behind this economic vision so that when we go to the World Bank, when we go to the IMF, when we go to COP meetings, we have very clear understanding of who we are and what we're capable of and what we're determined to deliver. And then if our partners internationally want to partner with us in order to achieve that vision, then of course that's where international cooperation is. But if our partners say, no, 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 that's not the vision we have for Africa, then we know who's our true partner and who's not.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dr. Osano, I'm coming to you next, but even as you add on to that, you can perhaps answer this after. And actually, the president of the Africa Development Bank talks about energy being the backbone of an economy, you know. But something else he said that was interesting, he talked about carbon lungs. It was either the president of Kenya, the president of the Africa Development Bank. They talked about carbon lungs and something about the Congo Basin being the world's biggest carbon lungs, even bigger than the Amazon. Perhaps you can explain what that is, and carbon sequestering, and why these things need to be factored as assets in this conversation. So even as you respond to that, afterwards, perhaps you can explain to us what are these carbon lungs and what is this carbon sequestration? Am I getting the pronunciation right? I hope I am, Dr. Sano.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about different questions. In fact, I wanted to add, just to put everything in context, we have nearly over almost 500 plus international agreements that touch on environment. Last year, we did a review about all the agreements that were signed by countries, either bilateral, regional, or international level between 1972 and 2022. And we realized that of all the commitments that were made out of all these agreements, only 10% were actually realized. So 90% of the commitments in all international agreements on environmental issues and matters have never been reached. So what we have is an international system where the multilateral processes is facing what we call a trust deficit, actually. That's what we called it. Mm-hmm. And so if we want to connect to what we are discussing here, we have an agreement on climate. The agreement on climate, Paris Agreement, and a framework convention called United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is important because climate itself touches on every sector. It touches on energy, it touches on water, it touches on agriculture, on forest, and so on, and land. But we have other agreements. For example, we have an agreement on biodiversity, the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have an agreement that looks at land degradation and certification. And across all these agreements, you find that we have had more agreements being signed, little action. And I think part of what the freshness that is being brought by the Africa Climate Summit, and rightly so, should be how do we actually stop talk and go to action. I think that probably informed what the president said at COP, because there's a lot of frustration. But to link that to your question about Congo Basin, so part of what Africa has are what we call the carbon sinks. Basically, when you have large, massive forests.
Carbon sinks.
Carbon sinks. You know, forests sequester, they capture carbon from the atmosphere. So the Congo Basin, for example, itself has within the forest itself and underground what we call peatlands. You know, that is carbon that is stored within the soil. It has enough carbon. It can store enough carbon that is equivalent to 3 years worth of total global emission. So it's a very critical ecosystem to the world, not just to Africa. But I mean, of course, you look at the development state in Congo, they would like to develop. I mean, you want to reduce poverty, you want to increase the income level. The question is, for the services that the forest, and it's not just Congo, you know, it's about 7 countries in the Congo Basin region, the services they're providing by sequestering this carbon within those critical ecosystems should allow them to be compensated because they are actually contributing to global climate stability. I mean, also we have our ocean systems, our water systems. Ocean systems are one of the largest, again, carbon sinks. So that's the conversation we need to have. But I wanted to also, I mean, building on this, you talk about food security. And I also wanted to demystify a few things. One, we can talk about food security. Again, let's go back to the basics and the fundamentals. Across all African countries where we work, very few farmers have the ability and the technology to do soil testing. Now, what we know, of course, that many regions across Africa, soil fertility is being degraded completely. And so and we don't have the right advisory services for them to apply the right fertilizers. So we have standard fertilizer application across the board, all different parts of the country. For example, we have national subsidy programs for fertilizer, but they are not contextualized to what we call different agroecology. So the fundamental thing is, can we get our soil testing services to our farmers so that farmers can know, are our soils acidic or are they basic? So do we need to add lime if the soils are acidic, or very basic thing. Number 2 is that out of all the food that is being produced in Africa, 40 to 45% estimated is lost at the post-harvest level. That means we need to invest again in agro-processing so that you can store food for longer, you increase the shelf life of food. So by just investing in post-harvest management of food produce, we can actually fundamentally reduce huge amount of food insecurity in the continent. Of course, the other one is trade. Very few countries really trade against each other. So you have a surplus in a country like, say, maize surplus in Uganda, and you have a deficit in Kenya. Even within a country, you find parts of countries have surplus and other parts have deficit. And that talks to the infrastructure. So you need the infrastructure that can allow you to trade even as you provide the infrastructure for storage, for bulk storage, and so on and so forth.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing like this is about climate justice. Mohammed, you're nodding. And my question to you is, I was listening now to a conversation during the Mo Ibrahim governance weekend, and President Ruto was recalling a conversation he had with Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, and he said he would tap into their fossil fuel resources until it makes more economic sense for them not to. So here are African leaders converging in Nairobi. Are you optimistic that they'll look at the bigger picture, or the immediate needs of their people will take precedence?
Even if they looked at the immediate needs of their people, that would still be okay. But what we need is a long-term strategic vision. The challenge we have in this continent, we don't have a shared long-term strategic vision. And if you look at the global geopolitics and the way the world is organized, you have three major powers. You have the US, which is the wealthiest countries and responsible for nearly a third of the historic emissions that have caused climate change. And then you have the European Union, that is also largely the colonizers of Africa, who have actually developed partly by exploiting the continent of Africa. And then you have Asia, led by China. These three strategic powers that are now the world's superpowers have a strategic vision, and in their strategic vision, they have Africa as a source of cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and as a market for their finished products. Now, the continent of Africa isn't at the table, which means effectively they're on the menu for raw materials, for cheap labor, and to be the market. If you go into shopping malls in this continent, you'll find Chinese products, and you find European products, and you find American products, because this is an easy market where they can actually dispose. And so what we need in this summit is for our continent to realize we have an opportunity, and we can only realize this opportunity if we develop a strategic vision for the continent. And we must make sure that strategic vision isn't narrowed to climate. It must address the structural issues my colleague Fadel had raised. Together with Fadel and a number of other African experts, we've put together a report called Just Transition, an alternative, climate development vision for Africa. And if you're interested, you should look at justtransitionafrica.org, because we've looked at the food deficit in Africa. We've looked at the energy deficit in Africa. We've looked at the lack of a Pan-African industrial policy, and how addressing these three things will help put Africa on a path to shared prosperity. And for me, I think when you look at some of the points that was raised by my colleague in relation to carbon and carbon sequestration, I want to tell you, the historic polluters are looking at the Amazon and at our forest as a source of carbon credits. So instead of cutting emissions, they see these as a way to actually buy pollution permits. So give Africa some crumbs, but continue polluting at the source rather than decarbonizing. So our leaders are falling for that, because there hasn't been much of climate finance. They look at these markets which have been proposed, and there is a specific one called Africa Carbon Market Initiative, which is being put forward through this Africa Summit in the name of attracting climate finance. And I want to tell my leaders and the people of this continent, let's not fall for this dangerous distraction. What the continent of Africa needs is to reduce emissions at the source, and for the historic polluters to pay for the harms that they've caused Africa, and for us not to provide them pollution permits. What they call carbon credits are effectively pollution permits. You buy off a forest in Kenya, by giving Kenyans a very small amount of money, and it happened in Segwer community, and it happened in the northern rangelands through the project that the government had been supporting. But speculators who control the carbon market will actually take the lion's share of that carbon price because they're the ones who are in the middle, brokering this relationship. And our countries will provide these, fossil fuel companies and these, countries and economies that are dependent on fossil fuels permits, and they will then account for these credits as the emissions reductions. So rather than cutting emissions at the source, they effectively transfer to Africa, and Africa, plants a forest or a tree for that matter, hardly, and protects some of the forest, and we let it go, and we see that sovereignty. So this commodification of nature, and creating a speculative market for brokers and for polluters is something this continent must reject.
Something this continent must reject. But listening to the President William Ruto, yesterday, the civil society has called these carbon markets greenwashing, which I think is the point you're trying to make. But the other point of view was that we need to take advantage. How do we leverage this to our advantage? And Kenya has passed, the President talked about signing a carbon markets law, but we'll come to that further. But Wangari, housing, right? I've heard a lot about creating green jobs. In Kenya, housing is the avenue this administration has taken. Does it make economic sense?
Yes, I think, and Philip touched on this, how our forests are really the biggest carbon sinks in the world. But we also need to look at how we can make our cities carbon sinks and how buildings can contribute to bettering the environment rather than, making it worse. I think most people don't know that 40% of energy that is, of emissions that are produced come from buildings. Mm-hmm. So it's important also that we use our housing, and I know you've heard about the affordable housing agenda of the governments, that both the past government and this government coming in. So it is important, if we're going to build thousands and thousands, maybe millions of new housing for people to be able to, to live comfortably, it has to be good for the environment and good for the people that live in it. So it's important that we look at that, and green building is quite a key part of that. And I'm actually quite happy to hear yesterday Governor Sakaja mentioned that he wants to have make it easier for people who invest in green buildings in Kenya or in Nairobi, make it easier for them. So they want to reduce the permitting of new buildings if they're green. They want to make the process of permitting quicker if they're green. So if we start to incentivize the market as well in this way and use real solutions, I think these are definitely the things that are going to push the market forward.
So what is a green building? Is it solar panels on the roof? Is it sewage system that recycles water? What's a green building?
There's many aspects to it. The easiest way I can say it is a building that really achieves the same thing a normal building does, just more efficiently, using less water, less energy, and less embodied energy. So embodied energy is actually the material or the energy that is used to make the materials of a building. And right now, when we construct our buildings, we import everything from China, we import steel, we don't make a lot locally. So that importation of the different materials that come into the country have a carbon cost. And we need to reduce that carbon cost. And that sourcing locally, using materials. We have plenty of sand in Makueni. We have plenty of rock. We have a lot of materials that we can use locally that do not need to come in from China or other countries. So it's important to reduce that carbon footprint. And the buildings, because we spent over 90% of our time in buildings really are the place to start.
All right. But if Africa is responsible, and I know you guys are saying 4%, somebody said 3%, then we have a lot of leeway, no? Okay, I was just inciting you there. But we'll come to that. On the question of carbon markets, what are carbon markets? Is it, as Mohammed has told us, the commodification? Is it the commodification of nature?
Absolutely. It's actually worse than that. It's pollution permits, because this is the actual transaction. Somebody who's a heavy polluter in the global north is now required to buy carbon credits. So they commodify a forest in the global south, buy a permit to continue their pollution with very little money, with crumbs essentially. So they continue pollution, but now they have a higher cost of doing business, because it's costing them money to continue their pollution. So what do? They happen to be very powerful price setters in the global economy. So they transfer that additional cost to their customers, including us, because we import a lot of products from companies from the global north. So at the end of the day, they give us crumbs, they continue their pollution, so they're not reducing emissions, and then they increase their prices and make us pay for it.
All right.
So this is not going to transform anything in terms of global economic power, in terms of emissions globally. So the people who will continue to struggle are people who are on the front lines because of these pollution permits that continue to be sold to us as the solution to climate finance. So, and I apologize for using this metaphor, disturbing metaphor. When somebody's lost in the desert and they're dehydrated, they're starving, they're about to die, it's very clear that the only way for them to survive, and it's happened many times, is to drink their own urine. And we've been presented with this because we're so desperate that there is no reparations for climate damage. There is no climate finance coming to help communities who did not cause climate change. And we're told the only solution available to you are these crumbs that allow us to continue the emissions and allow you a little bit of cash to survive, but don't think beyond these solutions. And I think we can do better. It's not fair, not reasonable for us and for our leaders to accept to be put in this situation where we have to accept all the false solutions, all the tranquilizing drugs in order to allow the polluters to continue to dominate the system. And this is a question of politics, as Muhammad alluded to earlier. These three major blocks, the US, China, the European Union, they do have a strategic vision for themselves for the next 100 years. And they will use their economic diplomacy, they'll use their incentives, they'll invent new distractions to nudge every country in the position they want to see them on that geopolitical map. And if we as Africans don't have a vision for ourselves for the next 100 years, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's vision. And that vision is not for Africa, and it's not by Africans. And I'll describe it very briefly, how they see us, how they saw us in the past, and how they see us for the next 100 years, so that we're alert and clear about what is happening. They see us as the place for cheap raw materials, as the place where they can dump the surplus industrial output that they produce. They see us as a place for exotic tourist destinations, and they see us as the place where they can outsource and dump obsolete technologies that they no longer need for assembly line manufacturing, and they call that development aid. That's how they saw us during the colonial times. That's how they saw us in the last 60 years in the post-colonial era, and that's how they want us to be for the next 100 years. And what we're talking about here is not Africa dominating the world or colonizing the world. No. We're talking about repositioning ourselves on equal terms with the other major blocks so that we rebalance the global economy. And this is not for saving Africa. This is for saving humanity. Right. So if our leaders don't have that united vision to say this is who we are and this is how we interact with the rest of the world, we're going to be in that same position we've been in for hundreds of years.
I know, Dr. Sano, you want to come in at that point, but we'll take a break because we must pay the bills. We take a break, but when we come back on the question of carbon markets, there is the ideal, and then Dr. Sano, perhaps you'll explain to Dr. Fadel, mambo kwa gra, the reality, mambo kwa ground, on the other side of this break.
Benefits of ordering with Glovo. Glovo allows you to order anything you want at the comfort and convenience of your home. Craving fried chicken or pilau or pizza? Easy and simple. Order on Glovo today. Glovo, order anything, we deliver in minutes. With Glovo you order anything unataka and when you get it una celebrate because kukuchoma imefika na wakati keki inafika ndio sherehe inaanza. Order Glovo will deliver in minutes.
Exponential potential.
Good morning and welcome to The Morning Fix. This is the show where we do ukarabati wa asubuhi. My name is Mariam Bashar.
And the most bankable host, Brian Aseli. Good morning, my neighbors!
Get up and get ready for the most electrifying morning show on your airwaves. Mariam and Aseli on The Morning Fix every weekday from 6 to 10 a.m.
I think Uganda is the only country that they can actually do a musical. All of them. Because they speak funny.
No.
They speak funny.
Umeshapatana mkisi wewe.
Otakwesa.
Only on 96.3 Nation FM.
All that talk about the best.
To get Precious as your Skiza tune, dial star 811 star 930 hash.
Skiza, non-nation. Own your dream home for as low as 1.98 million Kenya shillings in Vipingo Kilifi. SMS Vipingo to 22365 or call us today on 0740 400 215. Terms and conditions apply.
All right, welcome back to AM Live. With me in studio, we have Wangari Mushiri, Director Africa, Global Wind Energy Council. We have Mohamed Ado, Director Power Shift Africa. We also have in studio Dr. Philip Osano, Director Stockholm Environment Institute Africa, and Dr. Fadel.
Kabul.
I hope I'm the Fadel, because he kept saying Fadel.
Correct.
Fadel is okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. Dr. Fadel Kabub, President, Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And Dr. Osano, I was coming to you next. Were you coming in to weigh in on the climate, on the, what do they call it again? Carbon markets.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to, as somebody who's working in the scholarly world, I wanted to maybe put a few things in the perspective. That the principle underlying carbon market is not entirely something that is new or strange. It's one of the economic instruments that has been used, for example, in the European Union. The European Union emission trading scheme has been going on for almost 30 or 40 years. But there are three things we need to keep in mind. I think that's what's informing my colleagues' intervention here. One is that if our goal is to reduce overall global emissions, carbon markets is not going to contribute to emission reduction. Mm-hmm. Number two, if you want to think of an ideal world where we have a carbon budget and you distribute that carbon budget among all countries, there are countries that have overshot their budget. There are countries that have a deficit on their budget. The principle underlying the carbon markets is that in the short term, as we think about the bigger global picture of reducing emission, that countries that need to then transition to reduce their carbon share of the carbon market that's above their budget can then buy off countries that are not meeting their share of carbon market. So it's a distributive instrument. And in that sense, it actually makes sense because it actually allows countries that now have high emission levels if they're willing to then transition. And that's actually what is captured under what's called the nationally determined contribution and so on for every country. But number three, I think this is what's most important, is that the structure of how that market is organized is very important. And I think the issues being raised right now is that structure of carbon markets and how it's organized and who captures the revenues that come out of it is not necessarily the common person in, say, in a country in Uganda or something like that. But that's also fundamental because when you look at, emission tradings in different sectors, it's very different. So the biggest challenge is when you want to do it in forests, in agricultural land. It's very complicated. If you want to do it in industry, for example, energy generation, We know, for example, KenGen is selling carbon credit because it's very easy. You install a new technology that provides for more energy efficiency, so you reduce your emissions, and then you can buy credits from the emission reduction. So it's very easy, it's not controversial. But when you want to do it in land, where now you have farmers, there are many of them, they don't understand all this, how the payments are structured. Then you have middle people who then come in and actually take probably the largest share, and that's really the biggest concern. But I think also, again, going back to us paying attention to advice, that we need to have also local experts, that even as we work on carbon markets, experts can help identify which aspects of carbon market that can work for us. For example, the energy sector is working. Can we amplify and scale those up? Those that are very difficult, then how can we then deal with it? And then, of course, keeping the bigger picture of this narrative of, at the end of the day, carbon market is not going to be a solution. It's a distributive instrument, but we still don't need to lose the fact that we need to reduce emissions. And the countries or regions that have the highest emissions have to do their part. That should not be lost. I think that's what the concern is, that we are losing the bigger solutions, that this kind of, it's like a ameliorative effect. Like you're trying to, it's a distraction a bit, because you're losing the bigger picture of where we need to go.
But Mohammed, I mean, doesn't it get us to the same place? And I ask that because if we get carbon markets right and we make it expensive, and we make it expensive to not meet your nationally determined contribution, then they'll be forced to cut down on their emissions, no?
No, unfortunately. What will help increase the price of carbon is having a global cap in emissions. We don't have a global cap in emissions. And so how do you trade a credit in a market where you don't have a global cap? If we have in Paris, where we have nationally determined contributions, Kenya has one, another 190 plus countries have nationally determined contributions. The only way markets effectively work is you have a cap, and then within that cap, you can trade between polluting countries and less polluting countries. What they're effectively doing, and I want to put this out to Africans to understand, they're coming to take away all our low-hanging fruits at a time when we're required to contribute to solve a problem that we didn't create in the first place. So what the Paris Agreement has done is, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a big economy that has polluted, or a developing nation like Kenya that is powered by 92% of electricity that's generated using renewables, you have a responsibility to contribute through what is called the nationally determined contributions. So imagine when we all recognize that we're in a climate emergency and all hands on deck and we have to cut emissions, and you wake up to realize all your low-hanging fruit have been taken, and what is left for you are the hard to decarbonize sectors. Because what the Western countries are doing and the fossil fuel companies are doing is raiding Africa for cheap polluting permits. So from what the atmosphere sees, there's no emissions reduction. There is a transfer in emissions in the physics of the atmosphere. So think of this is a global commons problem. Think of our atmosphere as a big pizza, okay? 3/4 of that pizza has been misappropriated by 20% of the global population. If you think you and I and every citizen of this planet has a right to that atmospheric space to develop and to live within it, 75% of that atmospheric space, what is called the carbon budget, has been misappropriated by the historic polluter. And we now have a small sliver that is left that we need to use to develop. Okay? That small sliver is best used to help lift people out of poverty, not to sustain the high consumption patterns of the current industrialized countries. Look at the case of a typical Kenyan. We emit on an annual basis less than 0.1 tons of emissions. Compare that to a typical European, 7 tons of emissions per year. And then you compare to American, close to 20 tons per year. Now you ask a Kenyan to cede their development opportunities to sustain the lifestyle of an American who, in the name of wanting to feel good, will buy a credit and use that credit to account for a false emission reduction, which a Kenyan will be delivering in the name of attracting crowds. So I want us to look at this in the bigger picture. So from a climate perspective, where we have to decarbonize, we need to see massive, rapid, sustained emissions reductions, particularly at the source. The countries that got us into this problem, we shouldn't be falling into this trap where they commodify nature and provide us crumbs, and we all fall for it because the international community has failed to provide the climate debt and the climate reparations that we deserve. So let's not do those things. I think we are in an African Climate Summit. We need to internalize what is truly at stake. Mm-hmm. You would not help Africa and put this continent on a sustainable path that is climate compatible and resilient at the same time if you don't recognize the threats that we're facing. We are in a climate emergency. We're facing a big threat, and the threat is largely coming from fossil fuel emissions. 70% of the emissions that cause climate change come from fossil fuels and come from the developed economies. They don't come from Africa. Mm-hmm. In Kenya and in the rest of Africa, mainly South Africa and a few of our North African countries, we have emissions to avoid. Kenya is developing. And so as we develop, how do we leapfrog and be able to develop in a climate compatible way? That is the opportunity we need to recognize for this continent rather than doing the dirty work for these historic polluters.
Wangari, I'll come to you on the question of what other commitments are you looking to be made at this summit outside of, well, I guess it's all linked, but as a sector, you know, housing, urbanization, and all of that. But Dr. Fadel, my reading of COP27 is that this negotiations on the establishment of a loss and damage fund went down to the wire. The commitments amounted to about 100. The idea is that the countries will contribute, the emitters will contribute up to an amount of $100 billion or something like that. Did I?
No, they didn't commit any funding. It's still empty. So the 100 billion promise is from 14 years ago from Copenhagen.
Oh, okay.
And that was never delivered. 80% of it was not delivered, and whatever was delivered is not really 100% leading into transformation, because it's leading to more loans to entrap developing countries in that process. So on the numbers, on the finances, we have the promise from Copenhagen that was not delivered. We have a green climate fund that was established as a more democratic institution with equal voting power from developing countries. And that remains, the last time I checked, there was about $12 billion in that fund. So it's not even close.
Oh, that's what people are holding up. Because, you know, I saw some pictures. I was looking up Anita Swain on Instagram and Ms. Katiwa, who are attending the Youth Summit. And they were holding up tickers, and 12 billion was the figure, $12 billion US. And I can't remember the years, but I'll look it up.
Yes, so that's the Green Climate Fund. And then there's the Loss and Damage Fund that was established last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, and that remains empty, $0 in it. So maybe COP28 will be the place to negotiate, not the billions, but the trillions that need to be put into it. But let's put things in perspective. What we never hear about is that the global financial and trade architecture that was designed in 1944 and continued to be enforced over the years. 1944, when Africa was still mostly colonized, that's a system that was not designed by us, not designed for us, and that's not the financial architecture that will save us today. So what does that financial architecture do in terms of numbers? Very simple number to look at. If you divide the world into global north and global south, and that is historic polluters and non-polluters, and then you keep track of all the global financial transactions, exports, imports, interest payments, charity, remittances from workers, foreign direct investment, all the financial flows, the net amount is $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries every year. So as we lose $2 trillion annually, we're told we promised to give you 100 billion, and then we never see it. And we're told that, well, there are crumbs to be had here, either from carbon markets or from philanthropists from the global north, and that should be the only space for conversation. What we're talking about is looking at the bigger picture, the global financial architecture that takes at least $2 trillion from us every year and saying we want to redesign that global financial architecture so that it's more balanced and equitable. And that's not talking about the historical responsibility, the climate debt, the climate reparations that we're talking about. This is just the international trade and finance system that we operate in. So unlike COP meetings where it's the entire world negotiating a particular agreement, this is an African summit. This is African leaders defining what we want. And yes, we invite the rest of the world to come to Nairobi to witness our ambition, to witness the transformation that we want to see. We're inviting them to witness, not to veto our ambitions. So the responsibility of our leaders is to feel free, to be bold, to be looking at transformation, not just of Africa, but transformation of the global system. And then go to COP28 and saying, this is who we are, and this is what we want for us and for the world. And then see where the negotiations go. So move away from the crumbs, move away from the narrative and the space that's been created for us, and we're told you're not allowed to think beyond that space. That's the ambition that we want to see from our leaders this week.
Okay, but the $2 trillion US dollars you're saying they take away from us every year, if I understood you correctly. What are you basing that figure on?
There's studies looking at the international financial flows. It's called net financial flows. And that number, when I started looking at this as a student more than 20 years ago, used to be $500 billion. And we thought that was outrageous. And then it moved to $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. And the last study we have from a few years ago, it's outdated, is $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. So that is the conversation that we should be having when we talk about restructuring the global financial architecture. It's not about lower interest rates. It's not just about having a voice in the G20 or having a voice in the IMF and the World Bank governance system. It's about undoing the rules of trade and finance that have been established when we were colonized. We were not colonized because they wanted to develop us. We were colonized because they wanted to take our wealth.
Extract.
So that's the exact system that's still in place today. And how can we expect a colonial system to deliver benefits for Africa? It wasn't designed for that. It's not by accident. This is not a system failure. This is what the system is supposed to produce, and we can't accept that anymore.
Wangari, I'll come to you, Mohammed.
Just to give you an idea, in the renewable energy sector alone, we need to invest about $4 to $6 trillion to transition each year up until 2030. And if you look at the loss and damage fund, you look at all these other distractions that are coming into play, the levels they're playing at, and I think Fadel has touched on it very well, it's crumbs of what the global finance architecture is going to be in terms of investment into climate solutions. So in renewable energy, we spoke at the beginning of this session that Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resource. We have some of the best wind resources as well. If we're going to spend $4 to $6 trillion every year in transitioning to renewable energy, we should be getting 60% of that financing. But why are we talking about $100 billion when there's $4 to $6 trillion that are going to be invested in this same sector that we have the best resource of? So this is, I think, what I want to really emphasize, and it's important that that money comes in. Over the last decade, we've only received 2%. Less than 2% of financing into renewable energy. So people are building renewable energy around the world, just not in Africa. And so we need, and this is also to your first question in regard to what we expect out of the Nairobi declaration and some of the statements, we need that financing to shift from 2 to at least 10% coming into Africa. And if not more, I've just said we have the best resource. In addition to that, at minimum, we need to be looking at multiplying the amount of renewable energy that's on the continent times 3 and beyond, because we have the best resource. So if we want to look at how we can export and kind of work on, Fadel touched on energy being one of the key pillars and one of the backbone of our societies, we need to ensure that we build that out, because that's going to help us bring manufacturing into the countries. It's going to help us grow food. Energy is a key pillar for that. It's going to help our energy systems. It's going to help our cities, and it's important that we really invest in that. But we can't also just rely on a small fund, which right now has $0 in it.
Mohammed, do you have something to add to that?
I think there's something we need to recognize. We have 600 million Africans without electricity. We have 1 billion Africans without clean cooking. But this continent has immense potential. As you've heard from Wangari, we have solar, we have wind, we have geothermal. But what investment does this continent attract to support the energy transition? just 2% of the global investment in renewables comes to Africa. So on one hand, we have excellent conditions that will help this continent contribute to solve this problem. But when it comes to financial flows, just 2% of the global renewable energy investment comes to Africa. So why is it that our leaders aren't seeing the big picture? And until that time when we decolonize the climate narrative and center it around African interests. So we need to look back at the history of this continent. 60 years at the point at which we are attaining independence, we had Nkrumahs, Nyereres, and they didn't require the permission of the colonizers. So we don't need the permission of the polluters. We need to actually articulate a bold, alternative, compelling vision for Africa on African terms. If we continue on a business as usual path, we'll still be getting 2.1, 2.3, 4, and that will not deliver the transformation this continent requires. So if there is one opportunity our leaders have in Nairobi this week, it's for them to think of themselves as the Nkrumahs of this generation. Just like our forefathers helped this continent attain independence, how will they decolonize Africa's development? How will they decolonize Africa's climate so that this continent can hold its destiny in its hand and not depend on external consultants who are driving Africa's climate and energy policy making? I want to see African experts, African leaders coming together, consolidating the knowledge, articulating an alternative development path that delivers the best for Africa and helps Africa, safeguards the world's interest. When we do this, we're not asking African leaders to colonize, other parts of the world and dominate the discourse and the dialogue. We're telling them, engage to safeguard your well-being and your interest and do it in the best interest of the world. And that is a powerful position to be in.
All right. Dr. Fadel, before I come to you, Doctor, you had something to add to that?
Yes, on the investments in the renewable sector on the continent, we also have to be careful about the greenwashing process and about the green colonialism that's taken place on this continent and not contribute to it. So for example, you look at a huge component of renewable energy infrastructure that is being developed on the continent. A lot of it is for exports, and a lot of it is extractive in a way that is creating an entrapment in financial terms for our countries, but also adding to the ecological damage on the continent. Take, for example, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is presented to us as the ideal solution, because how do you produce hydrogen? You take water and you break the molecules and you produce hydrogen, and that becomes the fuel that is used. All of it is for exports. But when you invest in green hydrogen production in countries that don't have water resources, like my own country, Tunisia, even after the rains, the dams are at 30% of their level. We don't have water for agriculture, we don't have drinking water. And we're told it's not a problem. We can use water desalination from the Mediterranean to produce fresh water in order to produce hydrogen. Well, what does that mean? Desalination of seawater produces toxic brine, which is the salt that is dumped back in the ocean, which raises the level of salinity, which raises the temperature and destroys the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem. And we're talking about massive volumes for exports. In order to produce 1 liter of green hydrogen, you need a minimum of 28 liters of fresh water, not seawater, fresh water. So that, and it's all for exports. It's not to produce hydrogen for sustaining and developing the Tunisian economy, the Moroccan economy, the Namibian economy, or the South African. It's all for exports. So this is foreign direct investment with foreign companies to damage our ecosystem, produce green hydrogen for European consumption, and then generate the profits that are not reinvested on the continent, but repatriated to the global north. And then when the solar panels become obsolete after 20 years, 25 years, those solar panels are replaced with new solar panels imported from the global north with loans and interest that we must pay. And that is not transformative for the continent. That is not beneficial to our ecosystems. And it's exclusively beneficial for decarbonizing the European economy, for example. So we have to be very careful about the renewable energy investments, yes, but it's for energy to be used and consumed to transform the African continent, not to be extracted exclusively for global north consumption.
All right. I was listening to the president yesterday, Dr. Osano, and he said, you know, aim for 100 so that even if you get the 10%, it's better than aiming for 10% and getting 100% of 10%. But are there some quick wins we are looking at as African leaders converge in Nairobi?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Again, I mean, the conversation is very complicated. But quick wins. So we saw the president drive into the youth summit on an electric car. This is actually an opportunity, for example, because we can see, we just did a report actually where we were also looking at how can Africa develop without necessarily increasing emission. We need to change, for example, our transport system. The future of transport system is electric. We know that. That's a quick win. Kenya, I think, is already, I think now we have about 3-4 companies that are, you know, producing electric, not just vehicles, but actually, I think also electric motorcycles, the two-wheelers and the boda-bodas and the tuk-tuks. If you look at our youth demographics, we then need to make sure that when we are training our engineers, for example, we now train them for this future transport system. We don't train them for the past transport system. So I don't know how many, for example, universities, I talk a lot to for example, the Engineers Institute, to what extent are they now preparing the workforce for the future opportunities? And I think that's a quick win. We have a youth that is looking for employment. You talked earlier about green employment. We think we can tap into that. The second thing, I think Wangari talked about cities. You know, globally, cities have been seen as one of the areas where we can actually get major quick solutions because of the concentration of capital, but also population and so on. In fact, there's already a decision under the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that there's going to be a special report on climate and cities to then outline opportunities that we can find there. So how can we then mobilize the knowledge and experience and find out opportunities from examples where things have worked in Africa and then present those ones to be scaled up? Because once you have this taken up in those reports, then they can inform policy. But I wanted to, again, go back to one of my earlier points, is that in across many African countries, we need to create space in the system of advice of our policymakers, both in parliament and in the executive, to really have systematic science advice. If you look at most countries in the West, for example, United States, United Kingdom, they actually have, even at the presidential level, they have a presidential science advisor. Now, I think part of the struggle we have here is in most countries, we don't have that. We do have our national research system, but there's a disconnect between the research that is being done at the universities, at the national research systems, and the policy-making process. So rethinking that system becomes very crucial, because then we are missing advice that is very critical when these kind of decisions are being made. Except when there's an emergency, like when there was COVID, I think you could see our former president, every press conference he had on COVID, he was surrounded by scientists. You know? So again, let's invest in training our scientists. Let's invest in training our future workforce so that they're trained to tap into the opportunities of the future, not of the past.
All right.
Yeah.
Fadel, as your last word, you know, in terms of quick wins, although this would be controversial, debts, because you talked about net financial flows and all of that. The president talked about the debt millstone around the neck of the African continent. Do you expect that debt is an issue that will be canvassed?
It has to be part of the solution. And when we talk about climate reparations, for example, reparations is not just transfer of financial flows. It starts with, yes, financial contributions that are owed to us, and it starts with debt cancellation, especially for debts that have been paid many times over with interest restructuring and so on. And that's just one component of the climate reparations. The repairing a broken system means redesigning the global financial architecture, the international trade agreements, but it also means transfer of technology, not giving us a loan to buy technology from abroad to decarbonize our system. Transfer of technology meaning delivering the technological resources not to consume foreign technology, but to produce technology on the continent for the development of the continent. And that also means the technical capabilities that need to be developed so that we're not just consumers and manufacturers of products, but also innovators and developers of new technologies. And that means investing in education, investing in science, investing in research and development on the continent. And that's where technical cooperation comes in, but it has to be packaged with the entire framework of climate reparations, debt cancellation, transfer of financial resources, and transfer of technology and research and development capabilities on the continent so that we become self-sustaining, so we don't need charity, we don't need loans in the future.
All right. Wangari, your last word?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with Fidel very much, and I'm very passionate about the skills transfer. I think one of the things that has really helped me is when you look at even all in China, all the people who manufacture solar panels, they're some of the biggest manufacturers in the world, but their chief technology officers come from Australia. And it's because there's a lot of education around renewable energy and manufacturing and innovation. So you're able to take that skill, export it, and now China is using this transition as a key income source for themselves. So if we can do that as well in our universities, transfer the skills, the knowledge, ensure that that flow of information also comes from the global north to the global south. We learn from each other, we innovate around that. I think it's very, very important. I think the other thing is I can't emphasize enough financing. Everybody who's coming to the country for the Africa Climate Summit, we need commitments. We need real tangible commitments and money to get these projects off the ground. When you see what other countries are doing, countries that like the UAE, they're able to invest in large wind farms and solar farms. We want to be able to do that too, but we don't want to have to wait and be at the mercy of the global north. We need to be able to do it now, and this is quite important. So financing is quite important.
Financing. Absolute last word, Mohammed. It's well and good for leaders to meet in Nairobi. They may write a beautiful document, but how will they translate that into action as quickly as possible? I'm looking at the time.
So they first need to actually divide the declaration in two parts. The first part needs to address what we will do for Africa. And that means addressing the food deficit. We can't even produce enough of our staple meal here, maize. So how will we ensure we address the hunger that continues to stalk Africa? How do we address the energy deficit? How do we inspire a Pan-African green industrialization? Those are the things we'll do for ourselves. They must have a section that is addressed at our developed partners around the debt relief, what we'll do to reform the international financial architecture. The World Bank is coming to the continent in Marrakesh in October for the first time in 50 years. If we don't use that opportunity to reform that bank so that it actually services African interests, there is no way we'll actually deliver the financing that we require. What Africa needs is debt relief, climate reparations, but also reducing the cost of capital. If we're able to borrow competitively like the rest of the world, we'll be able to power our prosperity and develop in a climate-compatible way. So what will be useful is a division of what Africans will do for themselves and how Africa will engage together to influence the international system. And that second part is as important as the first part. And so my appeal is send a clear message to Paris, Washington, and London, and Beijing around the new cooperation between Africa and these powers of the past.
All right, we've only started the conversation. As we said, the summit kicks off today, and I want to thank my panelists for helping us put into perspective some of the discussions that will be happening. Wangari Mushiri, Director, Africa Global Wind Energy Council, thank you very much for being here this morning. Mohammed Ado, Director, Power Shift Africa. Dr. Philip Osano, who is the Director, Stockholm Environment Institute Africa, and Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who is President, Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He is also an Associate Professor, Denison University Economics. Thank you so very much. Your World coming up next.